So yeah, my talk's on all the reasons our cookbooks could stop working as we transitioned across vastly different environments. The reason you should listen to this is because we actually did this. We migrated hundreds of developer VMs, a complete pipeline, higher environments, functional test environments, and production web environment from a private data center to the Amazon Web Services cloud. And we made a lot of mistakes. So I wrote this presentation as if I could give it to myself 6 months ago and hopefully would have set me on a more direct path than the one it took for us to get here today. Also, searching for chef stuff is notoriously difficult in Google. I can't tell you how many times I typed in chef knife help and came up with a picture of a knife. Thanks. So our DevOps group was tasked to migrate to the cloud, and the motivations are pretty common. It's cheaper. Surprisingly, when we ran the numbers, the private data center that they were using was much more expensive. And we got more direct control. The DevOps group got access to more hypervisor level access than we had before, which we wanted. We wanted to be able to clone machines, spin up new ones more dynamically, and we wanted much more access to the network than we had. But our cookbooks had to support a pretty seamless transition. We had all these multiple higher level environments from performance testing, staging, training, demo, and they basically had to have very minimal, if not no, downtime as we move them from one place to another. We like to label all of our environments with chef environment variables, and that's great, but your recipes were quite brittle when we tried to condition off of where we were, so it was better for us to use role variables to do that, role attributes, and split them if need be, but never try to condition on where we think we are. So the base image, this is the first major change, and it's kind of at the core of what I use Chef for. I typically like the vagrant-like paradigm where you have a base image plus your networking surrounding it, plus your chef magic should lead you to a running environment. And this is part of the disposable infrastructure, disposable environment idea that AWS embraces also. So a lot of times you will update your image, and you'll do this kind of to factor out things that you would put in your chef automation into your image so you don't have to do it over and over again. But when we went to a completely new environment, we were basically redeveloping our image. We didn't have access to the private cloud image exactly. And so many cookbooks assumptions failed. We had new partitions. We would have, pretty good cookbook developers will validate all their assumptions. And so we had an Oracle cookbook that tried to check on a temp partition, and that failed because we were redesigning our partitions. We had base packages that changed. It's pretty easy to dump your base packages, but we missed some. And so if you don't have the package at all, you're forced to either redevelop or add it to your base image, or you have to then enforce it in your chef recipe. It's your choice. And base configuration. These were a little harder to detail because we had such a changing environment, but we accidentally hardened our image too much. We removed how groups would be created with users, and so now all of a sudden all of the services broke when they didn't have their group that they thought they were going to have. So what else can change? So even if we're the best chefs, we can't write cookbooks for things we don't know about, so get your image scanned early. Especially if you're migrating to the cloud kind of first in your group. It's called gaining ATO, authority to operate, and you have to pass your security tests. And for various reasons, our new redeveloped image wasn't scanned as early as it really needed to be, and it caused us a lot of heartache because we had to race to decide how we were going to harden it. These are actually really easy recipes to write. by comparison to some of the deployments we have. But it's nice to be able to prioritize them and not get them ahead of time, especially because as you migrate from major environment to environment, security is frequently about best practices, and a lot of these are negotiable. And when you have time, you can go to your security team and explain and possibly get their attitude changed or getting it written up that you'll change it in a different way. But if it's last minute, then you frequently just have to just bend to their will and get it fixed. Also, you can make a pretty useful cookbooks for hardening. A simple attribute tree lets you add and remove basically CVE straight to the attribute list. So you can dot each through them in your recipes and erase things if you need to, or upgrade them when they exist on the system. So aside from your image, yeah? Sure. In Ruby, they're different, right? But in Chef, they're not. So there's no, you should just be consistent so it doesn't confuse people. There is a, what's up?
Oh, no, I was just going to that point, you're talking about food critic rule 1, right? Yes. That's just like holy war, right? You know, which is,
Yeah.
To your point, I agree, right? You're saying it'd be consistent. That rule comes and goes out of food critic back and forth about whether it's a big deal.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't get hung up on
No.
food critic rule.
Just make everything the same way so people don't think they're different. But in Chef, there's no different. It utilizes a gem to make them the same. It's called a symbol versus a string. So you just have to be, but just make them all the same. I like the colon codes smaller. Thanks. So aside from your image, you're going to have resources outside of your operating system. All these for us are networked resources. And you have to either recreate them when you migrate, and also a good cookbook writer is going to validate their assumptions about it, and so these might have to change. They might not exist, and you might have to redevelop your deployments to use different resources. The first big one for us was our private data center had NetApp servers, and AWS doesn't. So we had to change a lot of our recipes and our clustering to either use different configurations, or we thought we were going to use NFS, but that becomes its own single point of failure. I know Red Hat recommends cluster or Red Hat storage. Amazon recommends connecting to a database. So these are just a lot of differences that we were forced to undergo as we migrated to a completely different environment, and we actually had different ways of storing our data. Our private data center also did its own security patching. We knew we were going to have to do that, but it's something that we had to build into our cookbooks. There's also a lot of centralized servers that are outside of our environment. So all of our update servers. So for Red Hat, that's Spacewalk. We have our own private Windows update server. Virus scanning. We had to get our DAT files from somewhere, and time server. And LDAP was probably the biggest hang up, where you need centralized authentication for, if anything, just convenience. But when we went from a static world to a dynamic one, we had fights with security about being able to have the power to create our own groups. So we went for a time of basically managing our own users. So I actually did this in Chef with a data bag of public keys, and you can add users to an environment file and quickly add and remove users' ability to log into an environment with this. That's much better than the headache of managing users yourself. So all your install files, you need to have access to them at all times and basically in complete control of them. For me, this is a rule of continuous deployment. When we moved environments, we cut off all internet access just to see what would happen. And we found some cookbooks were conveniently downloading things from the internet, which I consider a giant mistake. You can't trust that those websites will be up and that they'll host the exact same file at all times. So you should cache everything yourself. It has to be reproducible. We don't want anyone upgrading and you're accidentally getting the newer version of a package. Not that it's bad, but you want to know what you're getting. You don't want to accidentally get a full new version of rel because the main channel upgraded that week. And anything that doesn't go in our operating system channels is either going to go on the Chef server itself, or we have Nexus where all of our artifacts are pushed at the end of the continuous integration pipeline. So our production servers only get files from 3 different places. They get it from Spacewalk for their RPMs, they get it from Chef server, and they get it from the Nexus proxy chain. Now, you can put anything in a Chef cookbook if you want to, but we store our Chef cookbooks in Git. So if you use kind of the same rules we'd use for Git, large binary files don't belong there. You should be, let's see, if they don't, otherwise they should go to Nexus and basically only storing diffable, manageable text files and templates and simple scripts directly in the cookbooks. So when you're effectively doubling your environments, there's some other things to consider. Licenses, all of a sudden, if we had something that only had 100 licenses and we effectively needed 200 even temporarily, it can really hamper you when something basically refuses a new connection. And we also had enterprise messaging issues, which I'm not sure, you probably might not have control over this if you're just in the DevOps group. But if you have at design time, it's much better to be able to have apps that register and can take different messages back. But the design that preceded us was, a staging and a production enterprise message bus. So you basically couldn't have 2 applications log in as the same name into the staging server. So that caused us simply a organizational headache. Host names. Networking is near and dear to my heart, something that basically needs to be set up perfectly before anything happens. And so if your environment gets big enough, it's really nice if all your host names can be the same across environments, and you can use subdomains to separate them. So say if I have like app server 1 through 10, it can be named that, and then as I have a different environment, I can clone the whole machine basically and in its environment, and almost nothing changes but the subdomain. You can let DNS take care of the rest. That has saved us a lot of time, so you don't have to rewrite all the attributes and environments that simply point to a different host name. So Chef provides a lot of places where things can be stored. And so this kind of requires you to have your own meta organization. As your DevOps group grows, you don't have to kind of have a design meeting for every new cookbook and where everything goes. So we actually try to keep stuff out of data bags unless it's the same everywhere, or we need the encryption. The FIPS encryption is really important for DHS and for a lot of people. So we keep private keys and passwords in there sometimes. But aside from that, if it's going to differ by environment at all, we put it in the environment file. All right, templates are awesome. This is where you can really save yourself a lot. But they sometimes require a lot of creativity to get right. Clearly, it's easy to manage a whole file in a template. You can dump it in there. It uses Ruby ERB syntax. But sometimes it's hard to share a file because which you frequently have to do. If you own it, it's easy. So you can manage a single line. So I have a couple recipes for, workflows for teaching new people this. Here's an example where we add a line to Etsy hosts, and clearly we're not going to own all of Etsy hosts in a single cookbook. We might have different services that want to add a single line to it. And so we can basically match on our line alone, which is really easy in regex. If it begins like this, I trust that you put it in right. And if I can't find something like that, I'm going to render the whole file, and then I'm just going to add my line to the end. Now, there are clearly way more complicated configuration files where you can't have, where you want to manage multiple lines. So that can be really difficult, and there's no easy way to do that, except for a lot of services let you include a full file. And that really helps us. So we did this for things like Yum, Apache. They all have ways where you can include a comp file, and then we can manage that whole comp file separately. So we can use single line regex matching to make sure we're including our file. So each cookbook can make sure its personal configuration file is being included, and then we can manage the whole file separately. There are lots of Linux services that support this, and I highly recommend using it for chef cookbooks. So probably one of the most confusing thing to beginning chef people is how much Ruby you might need to know. If nothing's more confusing than the chef resource never getting even created because the attribute wasn't defined. So we store a lot of stuff in our environment, and if the default's not there, then the first time the Ruby operation operates on it, you can get weird Ruby errors. So here are some of those common, if you don't define this attribute, the second it becomes nil, and so it dereferences fine, but then you have undefined method each on nil class. So it helps you know what you're looking for. The most slightly harder one to see is the bracket that usually I see a lot on node variables where they're trying to dereference two attributes deep or one attribute deep. And so the first one returns nil, and then the second one fails to even dereference at all. And probably the most insidious one I see all the time is when people drop variables into strings, so they're trying to build like a URL. And now the IP address conveniently becomes nil, which Ruby converts to just an empty string. And so we'll build the string nicely for you, and that can make it all the way to a config file, and your service might even start up, but it's completely misconfigured. So you really got to write some code to make sure that you check your attributes, which not a lot of people do. I'm going to try to encourage more people to do that in my group. So Chef provides one option for us for that. There's the attribute question mark. Basically, is this defined? So people don't want to write a lot of code, so here's one line in Ruby you can put in your recipe that just says this attribute needs to be defined before we move on. I don't want to accidentally convert this into a null string. I think it's attribute in the attribute section and then node.attribute in the recipe. So we're just going to throw an error, and that way at least our error is much more readable. Then I'll get the error. Please set the Nexus IP address in the environment section. And so I'll intentionally not default it, so I don't default it to something that is meaningless in this environment, because Nexus are proxied, so we have a different one for each major environment. We can do even more error checking. One thing I don't see a lot of people realizing, in Ruby you can check the class of something. So you'll see people go from like a comma delimited string to a list to a hash, and you'll clearly iterate through that in the wrong way. So you can check at least to make sure that you're starting with the object you thought you were, and then write, hey, you're using the old version of the cookbook. This is a list now, or an array. So the class needs to be on the left-hand side, actually. Otherwise, it doesn't work right. So watch that. You can also check the class of any object if you don't know what it is. You can open up IRB or even write it straight in the recipe. .class on anything will tell you what class it is. Chef searches. So in a high availability environment, we want to automatically detect who all of our friends are. So I see chef searching used a lot for that. One problem is it takes a while to reach steady state sometimes, because as soon as you run that chef client run finishes, it's going to go register with chef server, but all the attributes get indexed. And this takes a while, so sometimes we don't appreciate that. And also we get failed runs and we don't realize why. So you can whitelist your attributes, which can be a pain because now you have to add to that whitelist every time you want to see a new thing. But Ojai has so many attributes, it can be nice just to only whitelist the ones you want to see. But if we want to keep chef searching, or we can just pre-write it in the environment file. As I say, if I use predictable DNS names and they don't change as I copy over environments because I'm using subdomains, now I can actually just build an attribute tree of what services are going to talk to what host names, and I don't have to worry about it. They know it ahead of time. It's already right before the service is even finished. This worked for some things and not for others. We had some trouble with Mongo because Mongo has to run post-installation configuration to set it up and talk to each other, but it's worked well for other ones. Logging. So chef log already exists and is almost everything you'd want it to be. But due to the nature of chef client actually kind of running twice, it runs once to compile all the resources and another time to actually execute them. Sometimes it can be really hard to find what you logged, or might not even make it that far, especially if you're trying to write a definition or a library. So your resources compilation themselves are suspect. So you can write this in one line. I wrote it out so you can see some ideas behind it, but you can write anything to a file really quickly in Ruby. So this is part of my just one-liner Ruby tips to drop in. I usually use this in debugging and pull them all out by the time a cookbook's done. But when developing a new cookbook, I frequently just want to write to my own file, only what I want to see, so I can even see it before the recipe finishes. So I'm clearly passionate about debugging, so I was really excited to test out Chef Shell when I saw it. It lets you, I'm not sure, you probably have never used it. You can load up an environment, and it's really made for iteratively going through run lists, and you can set breakpoints. But you also can see your attribute trees. You can't tell where they came from, at least I couldn't. If you can, I'd love to know how. But you can see if they're in default or forced default, the different priorities there. I couldn't find if you could figure out whether they were from a node, a role, or an environment. And you can also execute some more dynamic things like searching. In Ruby, you can check the public methods on anything. So if you do like node.public_methods, you can see everything you're allowed to check there, but there's not much else. So the organization of where things go. As I said, as your DevOps group grows, you really want to keep where all the attributes belong as independent as you can. It gets really confusing. There's like 16 different priorities for where attributes can be. I've bookmarked the page. But it's nicer if you know that these types of attributes are always overridden in the role, and these types are always overridden in the environment. If you keep those orthogonal to each other, then it'll really help your team debug them. All right, extending chef. So if you really want to get aggressive, you can add any functionality you want in Ruby in a library ever. All the functions are indexed, and this is one of the links to them, so that I've bookmarked. When you can add a new function to any construct, you can replace a function, which is probably pretty dangerous and you shouldn't be doing it. But you can also, in a little more advanced technique, you can add code before and after a method. And so I'm going to show you an example of that, since rarely does anyone do it, and I find it really powerful. So first, how are you going to add a message? You just have to namespace into it, and then you can add a function to anything. And I would typically do this in the library section of a cookbook. You can just depend on it, and you can pull in your library, and you can basically dependency inject it into any run. So we'll go into the class and just add a function. So this doesn't really do much yet, but you can set global variables and store stuff in here if you wanted to check it across recipes. So we could completely override the chef node lookup, which of course would be dangerous, but we're building towards something. So this is just the operator, so I want to give an example of that. And of course it takes an argument. And then if we really want to do something cool, we can copy any method in Ruby. Alias method, it's kind of complicated, but basically you're saving off a copy of a method. Once we've saved it, now we can monkey patch, which is just Ruby's technical term for completely replacing a method. And then we can call the old method. So I put this code here because I think you should really read through it, where we can do anything before and after the original method that we want, call it, and then send the return back. And we can add debugging here. I wrote a blog post on basically checking for nil here. So anyone if you tried to access an attribute that was nil, we could throw immediately before the cookbook did anything. We could know that someone tried to access an attribute that doesn't exist. Sadly, in that case, you have to define it in like 3 different classes because there's a whole bunch of ways nodes can access stuff. But it's not too many. So that's the most advanced thing I think I've done in Chef, by other than editing the yum package class to do more than I wanted it to. All right, so I got through everything I wanted to talk about, but I love Chef. If anyone has any questions about the work we did or any tips, you can ask now or come up to me afterwards. You're close. It's perfect. Anything? Yes. Yeah. Sure. There's only 2 interesting cases of that. One was just there were community cookbooks that were downloading things from the internet, and I considered that dangerous. And now this community cookbook was pretty advanced, just no one had realized you could override the attribute of where it got the file from. Like in the Java cookbook, you can just say, here is where I'm, it'll go get it from Oracle maybe, or you can just say, please get it from my server. And if someone's already done the work to put the attribute there for you, and it's a community cookbook, there might be just a lot of attributes to read through. And the other one that was really hard was the gem. So like some cookbooks will add gem functionality. This is actually done early in the run. It's done before the resources. So in Mongo, because it's a JavaScript interface, they'll download a gem for interacting with Mongo in Mongo's communication. But because this is done first, it was failing early. So I actually had to go in and add the ability to download it from a different place. And so I don't think I have the code with me, but basically the gem install is installing functionality directly into Chef. So I had to go add a different source location and say, I want to be able to override this in the attribute. And in my source, I'm going to pull the Mongo Chef gem, communication gem from Nexus and install it. Does that make sense? Cool. Thank you.